And I wonder, in today's environment, shouldn't be the first commandment, we need to secure Europe's future?
We have been seeing a shift which has happened over a long time.
Then the question is how the Europeans come in.
And this is why Europe needs to defend itself and its regulatory capacity.
The clock is ticking, and even losing 5 years at this stage matters a lot. Today I have a wonderful guest with me, George Papaconstantinou. George, welcome to this lunch talk as well, and great that you join us.
Thank you, Rolf. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
You were a parliamentarian, Minister of Finance, when Greece dropped into the sovereign debt crisis, and probably that was one of the most complex and difficult situations a policymaker can face when coming into office. Now you're heading the Florence School of Transnational Governance. And in that context, you have also published recently a book, The New World, New Rules, Global Cooperation in a World of Geopolitical Rivalries. The book was published essentially in parallel to the second Trump administration taking office. And can you help us in understanding what is going on with multilateralism?
Well, it's very hard to write a book about the current political moment, of course, because things are moving so fast and every day there are news of developments and initiatives. When we wrote this book together with Jean Pisani-Ferry, when we were both at the European University Institute, what we were trying to do is to understand a fundamental gap. And that's, if you want, for economists, it would be a mismatch between demand and supply. And that is that, on the one hand, we live at a time when, whether you're looking at climate change and biodiversity, whether you're looking at issues around data flows, whether you're looking at trade or finance or health coming out of COVID, right? So the need for global rules of engagement and what we call collective action is bigger than ever, right? At the same time, you have the actual appetite from countries for doing exactly that is the lowest that we've seen in a very long time.
Can we, if I may say, could we even say, well, with Trump, that appetite has dropped pretty much? And I mean, if you would have to rewrite the book now, or write the book now, the title may be New World, No Rules.
Yes, actually, some people have said that. To understand the moment, one needs to go back and realize that we have been seeing a shift which has happened over a long time. We know that in certain policy areas, there is even some continuity between successive US administrations. Take trade, for example. The attitude to trade is not new. It was pretty much the same under the Biden administration. But at the same time, it is absolutely true that what we're seeing now is a more fundamental break. To put it in very stark terms, if we were thinking of the US as the guarantor of the multilateral system of rules and institutions, it then became a challenger. And now it is the force that is actively undermining it and is trying to deconstruct it. If you listen to US policymakers from the administration, they will say that this system of rules is actually being weaponized against the US.
I mean, for me, basically, and you made the point that it's a more continuous process. And also in the book, you say with trade, right, what was introduced under the first Trump administration in backstepping from the WTO was not reversed under Biden. We can say also, for example, with defense, Obama already made the point to the Europeans, you need to spend more. And that has essentially continued. I mean, my reading of this is a bit, what we see is basically a change or a consolidation of different fractions in the US electorate. And Trump has built his power on a portion of the electorate that has not benefited from globalization and from the US having this role as a hegemon, as the country that actually establishes the order and safeguards the order. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would, but I would say that there is something more that we're seeing at the moment. There is an ideological belief that the current system of global governance doesn't work for the US, and therefore that we need to replace it by something else. I don't think this is something that we've seen before. In that sense, when you hear threats on territorial integrity and self-determination of countries, from Canada to Greenland and Panama, that's completely new. So the rules of behavior, let's put it that way, is something that we have not seen before. This backtracking from the normal rules of behavior, and it carries across a number of areas. Think of tech, right? There is a very clear attempt to sort of perhaps trade tariffs for looser regulation, so that the US threatening us for tariffs and take tariffs back if we loosen in the Europe our regulation for big tech. This kind of behavior is fundamentally new.
It's true, and again, and I come back to what I said before. For me, I mean, and actually you can take credit also for the point that you come up with this term transactional. Before, now it's in everyone's mind. But the fundamental point about transactional is basically no rules, right? Or, I mean, one way of looking at it is there are basically fundamental beliefs, which is the US moving out of the paying agent for an order as the hegemon and saying we are not the ones who will pay for everyone. The second belief may be if you want to have access to the world's biggest consumer market, you better pay for it or you need to pay for it. But within those beliefs or around those beliefs, basically the rules are abandoned. And you are transactional and you combine issues as it serves you and you push that belief the way you can. So rather than having established new rules, we are kind of actually now actively in a transition phase. And I'm just wondering how much then the notion of having rules can help us.
There's two kinds of issues, right? There's the global commons issues, climate, health, data, the backbone of the internet, and then there's international interdependence issues, trade, finance, taxation, even. So I don't think there is a way to move forward in any kind of positive sum outcome without a basis of rules. You cannot go to a fully transactional space in these areas. I mean, you can if you're forced to, but it will be detrimental for all the parties concerned. And this is where the conundrum comes for the European Union and Europe more broadly. We are a rules-based entity. We are the only bloc left standing that believes in a system based on rules, on institutions with clear mandates and powers. And we are now squeezed in an economic security and national security logic between the US on one hand, China, Russia on the other. And we have to figure out how much of the rules that are in place are still worth preserving, because you cannot go back and, to status quo ante. You have to pick a little bit and choose. But we can also not abandon completely the rules that are the bedrock of the international system.
I mean, again, on that I may have a somewhat different view. If we both agree that the shift that we are seeing is a bit more permanent, then the attempt to try to stick to the rules is a difficult one, because we may also have that forward-looking and we need to find the new system. When we are in that transition period, maybe it's the course of action. And I think a bit when you mention the global common, we know that one of the things that to maintain the global commons is, instead of having a one-shot game where everyone takes advantage in the short run, you have a long time horizon, and that is what it takes you in actually to move things forward and create collective action, right? But it's still an actionable strategy. It's not first order a rules-based strategy. And I think maybe it's also a bit one needs to think around those terms in order, and we talk about finance then and talk about trade in order to find the new regime rather than trying to stick to old rules.
Can I give you an example of what I mean here? Let's take climate. Okay, the US is pulling out of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is a very loose mechanism, which, however, has managed to put the system forward. The EU can continue to honor its climate ambitions by forming and leading a coalition of the willing with other countries, China being one of them, India being possibly another, Brazil and the others, who continue to want to push ahead. So you're sidestepping the formal mechanism, but you're still sticking to the rules and the goals that were agreed on an international level. You're just doing it with a coalition of the willing. So in a number of areas, you would have to go with this kind of coalition of the willing solutions, and sometimes sidestepping or ignoring the US, because the US, meaning climate, the US is about 11-12% of global emissions. So we can do without the US, and even within the US, there will be forces pushing in that direction.
I mean, there I perfectly agree. And I certainly also agree that it's worth to preserve the global commons, right, as a principle. And that the way, also the pragmatic way you paint for going forward in having clubs and having coalitions of the willing is a good one. The question is, how do you get there? And particularly when I think about the global south, okay, it's a bit the question, how do you want to come along? And I also agree the fact that US is stepping back from multilateralism. USAID services are stopped in many areas, offers an opportunity for the Europeans to fill the space. Then the question is how the Europeans come in, okay? And here again, I mean, do we want to come in with principles or do we want to come in transactional, if you wish? And my take is, or let me put it a bit more bluntly. So we have an interest in global commons. When you approach the global south on that, do you want to come as a preacher or as a merchant? I think you may be more welcome when you come as a merchant that actually offers some benefits. And that is what I mean in that regard. You can do good, but the way of approach it would not necessarily be first and predominantly principle-based, but you need to offer something. And I think that is the opportunity that one should take.
The best merchant is the one that has some principles behind them also. So I believe in realism based on values and principles. So I think that's what we should be doing. And you talked about the global south, and across a number of areas, from trade to finance, of course, there is a lot to do with the global south, and much more than we're doing at the moment. It was extremely positive that the EU finally did the Mercosur deal, for example, despite some internal opposition within the EU by particular countries. It is very good that the EU is actively looking to form new trade agreements which are complementary and not substitutive to the WTO framework. So again, here you try to adhere to some of the rules of the WTO framework without being completely within it. So it's not an either or. I think there are ways to combine. But when you do that, you also have to recognize that you will accept to play by other people's rules as well. So let's take an example from the area which is much closer to yours and to the ESM. When we're talking about global financial safety nets, right, and where the global financial safety net has fractured to a number of financial safety nets, there is cooperation now between regional financial safety nets. That's based on principles, right? It's not completely up in the air. And in that sense, it works. It's a coalition of the willing. It is being able and ready to pick up some of the role of the US, but by building new alliances.
No, that is true, that there you have a structure where the cooperation among institutions indeed works to a large extent, but even there you feel obviously with BRICS countries expanding their role and that there is some criticism. You have then respective regional kind of confinements of what countries or kind of also institutions are allowed to do, but at least there is a structure. And we also, I must say that so we have this layer of the IMF being at the center, and that is still recognized, which makes it a somewhat better regime than, or more functional regime, what we have, for example, in trade, right? So I think in that regard, there is we still have a center, and B, we have those regional options that work practically, and that actually, indeed, I would agree, that helps. My question was only, for example, when you think about trade, and we have an interest in economic security, which means also we need to reach out to big emerging markets in order to secure that market as for supply and demand. And this is happening also with trade agreements. Just the point is, how do we do it? And I think one must acknowledge, and certainly when it comes to biodiversity and environmental standards, we must also be willing to acknowledge that those countries want to have their benefit from it. And we cannot just come only with the principle, even if we want to, of course, promote it.
Not only the benefit, absolutely. So we would need to somehow fund some of the issues that are on the table, but also a seat on the table. So even if we go back to the IMF, if we want to avoid centrifugal forces in the global financial safety nets further than the ones that we have at the moment, you've got to accept that Europe, for example, would be diluted within the IMF compared with its current situation and voting rights. It's not normal that some European countries have a bigger stake than, say, India, for example, in the IMF. So there is a give and take there. And I think you sit on the table and you say, I want to pursue these rules, in conjunction with all of you. But in doing so, I'm willing to share some of the power that traditionally has been in the West in running those organizations.
I think on that one, we agree. One of the points that we see with the Trump administration coming up, and that will bring me also to Europe, but one of the key things that we see with the Trump administration that we also notice is the change in communication. And that is just a very significant one. And that raises a bit the point on how do we think about communication, and we will then also think about communication in Europe. So I mean, you ran countries in a crisis. If you think back then and if you think now, has communication changed a lot, or what is the lesson from then for what you see as key communication elements now?
Communicating in a crisis is something extremely complicated, of course. By no means can it replace actually managing the crisis, but it is a necessary part of dealing with the crisis. If you get your communication wrong, you're going to make your crisis so much worse. And if you manage to get the communication message across properly, then you will improve the way that you're handling the crisis, the way that the crisis is perceived by citizens, and therefore actually reduce the length of time you're in a crisis. You're absolutely right that we are today in a quite different environment. Communication is much more instantaneous. It is often, unfortunately, also handled through social media platforms. It is an extremely potent tool. And we are in an environment where controlling the narrative is a big part of politics and getting messages across. So policymakers can simply need to be able on top of controlling the narrative. And I say this in a good sense, controlling the narrative and trying to put forward their ideas in a way that are convincing and manage to get citizens with them. And when the narrative is so against globalization, against collective agreements, against international organizations, against Europe overall, because the US administration is clear on not liking the European Union, we need to have our own narrative and to be able to counteract that.
Not surprisingly, actually, in what you're just also saying now, you come close to some of the experiences also that we had with the crisis, and which we jointly discussed actually also in a project that your school and ESM ran jointly on public communication in crisis. And when I remember back what you said about this, having the narrative and being able to anticipate events in the past crisis, one incident where this actually failed drastically was unfortunately in the situation for Cyprus, where the people were just kind of not prepared for the news that they would be receiving, and therefore the first attempt to bring up a program failed, and then there was a second attempt, and just the cost increased.
We could spend the rest of the afternoon coming through bad communication in crisis. And I think this is why the work that we did together in that seminar and in this handbook that we're going to come out, we can maybe even preview it, here it is, Handbook on Crisis Communication for Public Institutions. That's what's so important, that at the end of the day, it's a discipline like any other. You need to look at what you did right, what you did wrong. You have to remember that you are communicating the crisis in a sea of information where you're looking for the usable stuff. There's a lot of noise and little information. Think of COVID. Think of the uncertainty that we had around, do masks work? Do they not work? What's the best way to not frighten people, but also get them to do the right thing to reduce the spread of the virus? So in every kind of crisis, and today we live in a new crisis, you need to adapt your communication tools based on some solid principles that both research, academic and others, but more explicitly practice, gives together. I'm very happy that we've done this project, because I think that this this should be helpful for policymakers moving forward.
Maybe in moving it a bit back to today's situation, and when you were talking about reflecting, since that time till today, technology has changed, the impact of social media has changed, but I think also maybe the rhetoric has changed in the sense that nowadays extreme parties are much more important also in the European context and shaping much more the national agenda. And in that regard, just one observation, I like in your book, again, you come up in the end, you try to boil it down to 10 commandments, 10 simple commandments on how to manage the situation. And commandment number 1 is then actually recalibrating the priorities when pursuing collective action, and global commons come first. That's the first commandment. And I wonder, in today's environment, shouldn't be the first commandment, we need to secure Europe's future? Obviously, that entails the global commons. On that one, we agree. But with the rhetoric that we have nowadays, if we want to sell also that agenda in Europe and get the ingredients together, isn't that the first principle?
Yes, it is. And I think you need to remember that the book was written with an economic viewpoint, and therefore, let's say, the more hardcore security issues were left out. It is very clear that to secure the rest, you need to secure your security and be able to safeguard your future. This is why, and security is a broad concept, right? It's not only military, and defense. It is, of course, economic security above all.
When I said secure your future, it's really in the broadest sense possible, right? So if we want to preserve Europe's role in the future, we need to combine the forces. And then you have the agenda items that you also paint in the book. That means first, be conscious of your own strength and build your strength as much as possible, right? And what is the European agenda that we need for this? That would be the first step before even reaching out, isn't it?
And I think that, in fairness, Europe is moving in that direction. The concept of strategic autonomy and de-risking that has been bubbling in the policy discussion for some time now becomes real. Except when we were talking about de-risking, we thought de-risking from China. Now we're also talking about de-risking from the US. And if we build policies around these concepts, anchoring on the Draghi report and the Letter reports, on the need to ramp up defense expenditures, then you build together not just a narrative, but also a real set of policies that can guarantee, as first and foremost, can secure the future of the continent in a very different global environment. Having said this, we cannot forget that some of the global public goods, such as climate, are absolutely existential. So if we miss that boat, we can secure the rest, and then in 10 or 20 years, we will have gone beyond the tipping point that it will be irreversible.
No, that's true, and that is very serious issue, because in that regard, the clock is ticking, and even losing 5 years or any time due to different policies at this stage matters a lot. Maybe one other point that in your 10 commandments that I found very interesting is when you say basically that align incentives with the private sector, but also be willing to go to war, which I understand as defending yourself ferociously, but it's about defense. But if you think about it in this current setting, wouldn't it be rather be willing to defend yourself ferociously and take the private sector along, rather than trying to...
on a number of issues, obviously, if we're talking about European public goods, if we're talking about from defense to innovation and R&D, you cannot do this without a very robust private sector. So that means creating the right framework conditions, the right incentives, etc. The problem begins when the private sector captures policy. And we're seeing this very clearly in the US. Think of the tech sector. It is completely capturing policy to the extent of having dangers to democracy itself. So you need to align your incentives with the private sector. You cannot attain your climate ambitions without the private sector. You cannot innovate, obviously, without the private sector. You cannot defend yourself without the private sector. But when the private sector And here's the danger of the 1 trillion companies in the US that we're seeing very, very clearly. When the private sector co-opts government and decision-making, then you need to go to war with it. And that's what I mean, metaphorically, of course. You need to defend yourself. And this is why Europe needs to defend itself and its regulatory capacity, its willingness to regulate its own space against US big tech, which has a completely different idea of regulation, privacy, and the like in the space of digital commons than we do.
But at the same time, it's also clear, and that is an ongoing discourse, that the fact that those things happen in the US changes the environment for European companies. I agree completely with you. We need to preserve the space that we want to have, but there's also a good point on reflection on what is the optimal space of regulation, for example, that we want to have in the financial sector and elsewhere. And the question is now just asked with more urgency than it was asked before.
I think that, as you know very well, Rolf, the regulation, deregulation agenda ebbs and flows, right? So it's like a wave. We have a crisis in which we realize that there was too little regulation, and then we overregulate sometimes, and then we think that we have overregulated, so we need to. So yes, it is a good time to think of lightening or streamlining European regulation where necessary, but we can absolutely not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Regulation is there for a very good reason. I am uncomfortable with some of the ideas that I hear from the other side of the Atlantic regarding financial regulation. Are we going to go back to the kind of problems that created the global financial crisis in the US and the Eurozone crisis afterwards? No. I mean, especially in a world of fintech, in a world of non-banks doing financial work. So we have to be very careful what we want to preserve. And yes, absolutely streamline and make the life easier for innovations to come through and for entrepreneurs to do their thing.
We have touched a broad range of issues, George. If you look at Europe in this environment and you would have to try to kind of put in 1 or 2 sentences where you see now the main course of action and to address that situation that we are put in with the new US administration, what would be the advice?
I would say it is forcing us to reckon every crisis has forced Europe to look internally and see which part of the fantastic edifice that has created, because it is a fantastic edifice, was not working well enough. We learned from the global financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis. We learned during COVID. And I think every time we take the lessons and we improve, I think this is it's a much bigger wake-up call than any of the previous crises, because it touches many more policy areas, and it comes down to the core of what Europe is and how it can sustain itself in a very rapidly changing global environment. And I am hopeful that actually we are getting the message. I'm just hoping that we will go a little bit faster and with a little bit more courage sometimes in making decisions that are for the collective good.
I completely agree, and I think in the spirit of your book also, let me add what you said in terms of having the courage. The point that you make in your book is be mindful of your internal strengths, build them, and be pragmatic in building the new rules. I think that is probably the essence. We covered a lot of ground, George. Thanks a lot for this conversation, and it was great talking to you.
Thank you very much, Ralph. It was a pleasure.